And I remember when I did this the last time, I thought, I'm going to change this because it's really boring. And nothing that irritates me more than to give a talk that's boring. And I couldn't figure out how to spice it up, just talking about the mechanics of how I run the class. So you got it with all the blanks filled in so you can read through it and see how that works. And so I thought I might just answer questions if anybody had them now about the mechanics of the class. It's pretty basic. We meet once a week for an hour. I have a lesson that I teach each week in the class about character, disciplines, and the topics are listed in your notebook. And our notebook is in the hall on the table. You can peruse through that and look and see exactly how it looks. So there's one for men, Leadership 1, one for women, Leadership 1. There's one for Leadership 2, which that's men and women together. And so that's the lecture part. That's usually 30 minutes of the class. And the classes are an hour long. And then there's the scripture memory. Now, one of the things that I did this year that I don't like, because I had 30 people in the men's class, it took too long for everybody to quote their verses. What I like is for guys to quote their verse in front of the whole class. It's good for them because they learn how to talk in front of a group. And it's amazing how many of them will say, oh, I had it down pat, and once they start saying it in front of the group, their brain goes blank. And I said, one of the things that leaders have to be able to do is communicate under pressure, and so this is good training for you, and so they would do that. But I'm not doing it this year, and so they will quote their verses to each other. They'll just find somebody and two one-on-one before the class starts. And so that's a little, it's not near as, I thoroughly enjoyed the time when they would quote their verses. And so that was where my best harassment would come out, is when they were quoting their verses. And I would say things like, wow, new translation. Just So anyway, if you have a class under 12, I highly recommend the one where they quote the verses in front of the class because it really is good training for guys to be able to talk in front of a group and to think and remember under pressure. So the way that worked is they brought the verse, and the verses are listed in your notebook, on a 3x5 card, and they could use any translation they wanted, and they turned the card in, and I kept it. They had their own card if they were using 3x5 cards, and so I would ask the guys the verse, and I would write a score on the back of the card. I usually almost gave them 100 every time, unless they really butchered it. Obviously, they started 5 minutes before class, then I would give them less. And then I would keep the cards, and so every class I would ask everyone 2 verses, the current week's verse and 1 verse from a previous class. And so I would go through and pick them out before class, so all the verses were different. In other words, I'd ask you 1 verse, and you a different verse, and you a different verse from the previous week, so they would hear those verses in class from others. And so that was, like I said, that was one of my favorite parts of the class, which I don't do now because of the numbers of guys in the class. But I highly recommend that one. Book reading, that's the one that will create the biggest. A lot of guys don't read much. And so I have books picked out that I really like and are fairly easy to read in the sense of readable. I've collected them over the years. Holy Sweat is a great book for guys, and it's very readable. And This Was Your Life is another one. And anything by Steve Farrar. He writes books for guys, and they're, again, very readable for guys, and there's good stuff in them. Point Man is a classic book, so there's some good ones in there. And so I have almost all of his books. And so I almost always did 50 pages a week for the last 40 years. The last 2 years I dropped it to 30, and I don't know why, just getting soft in my old age. And I think the reason I did that is because I started out with the ladies with 30, and there was a number of husband-wife combinations, and I started getting this, not from the guys, but from the ladies. They want to know why they only had to do 30 and the guys had to do 50. And so I have to be careful with insulting ladies. I remember we did a funeral here this last week or 2 weeks ago, And whenever you do one, you'll see people that you haven't seen for a long, long, long time. There was one particular lady that came, and I hadn't seen her, and it was kind of fun to see her. And so I sat at the dinner after the service in the gym and chatted with them. And I said to her, I said, do you remember when we used to play softball together? Our church had a softball league, and we competed, and you were on the team. And I said, I was playing first base, and you were playing right field. And one of the guys in the church was playing shortstop, and he threw the ball to me at first base. And, I mean, it was sort of like a, and I yelled at him and said, you throw like a girl. And she was in right field. And, I mean, it was like a second. And she was right here. And she said, what do you mean by that? I said, I mean, he throws really hard. Oh, my dad was, I tell people, if some of you younger ones won't get this, but he was a cross between Archie Bunker and John Wayne. And so he was very much of a old school men-women thing. The ladies worked in the house, the men worked in the barn. It didn't cross the line. It was too basic, and so I grew up with that. And so Patty and I had years of adjusting. She grew up in a family with 3 girls. Her dad treated them all like they were Cinderella. And so we had a cultural clash when we got married. Funniest years of our marriage was when we moved in with my mom and dad. First off, when we were Darien farming, we made a little apartment house, and we lived with mom and dad. And my dad loved Patty. I mean, he just thought she was wonderful. But he would regularly say things that would create conflict. But it was fun. She thought I was great after living with my dad, so that was good. Also, questions on that? Anything? How the classes run? The reading? Go ahead. I start the class the first weekend of October, and I end it the end of April or the end of May, depending on my bicycle schedule and fishing schedule. So this year I'm ending at the end of April, and so I'll have to double up on some lessons to get them all covered. So there's 28 lessons in the syllabus, and so if you, but with misses with Christmas, some of those ones we do, it typically took 8 months to cover it, but this year I'm going to do it in 7. So I did miss 2 weeks because of Christmas and everything. Every year except the last 2 years, and again, it was because of the number, I would schedule not last year, the year before, we had 2 services. All it was leadership class sermons towards the end of the year. And so we have a Saturday service, 2 Sunday services, and so 2 weeks in a row, we had, I think we scheduled 3 people per service. And their little sermonette was 10 minutes to 15 minutes long. So each week, that's all we had was those guys. And it's one of the favorite weekends of the year. People thoroughly enjoy it. But those 2 weeks, I would fill up next year's class. I didn't. Oh, in the class. I'm sorry. Okay, I misunderstood you. That's just, again, I haven't done it the last couple of years because I had too many in the class. I do it in Leadership 2, where they'll share about something they've learned in their reading. I have them write stories, 2 stories that take 2 to 3 minutes to share. That I use stories with my witnessing. It's a great way to introduce, hook people, and so I illustrate that, and so they write those and they'll share those, and then just so we get to know each other, the sharing and stuff. Yeah, and then Leadership 1, when it's smaller, then I try to get at least one every week. I just keep track, okay, who shared this week, who shared this week, who shared this week, and I let them know, okay, next week I'm going to have you give us a little report about your reading or a story about how you came to Christ. And so that's part of every week's class. Like I say, I haven't done it for the last 2 years because I've just had too many people in the class to do it, which I'm going to next year. Pastor Mike he's going through leadership this year, and he's going to teach a class next year because I want him, that's been the best thing we've done. And if I die tomorrow, that'll be a huge vacuum, and so he's going through it this year, mostly just to hear me learn how to do it. So, and then next year he's going to actually teach one of the classes. We'll make an extra class, and so I'll reduce the numbers because 30 is. I don't like doing the class with that many, so we'll cut it way down. Let him do one, and then I'll probably attend it just for some coaching aspect of it. Yep. 5 minutes. Just schedule 5 minutes for somebody to share. And so they'll give a report about what they learned in the book, a testimony, any number of things you can. But that speaking, for when you talk about leadership training, that public speaking is really a key part. It's a lot of them don't like to do it, but it's just a good thing for them to learn how to do. They learn how to communicate under pressure. Oh, in the class? I typically don't go down into high school unless they're with their dad. This year I've got 2 or 3 high school boys, but they're in there with their dad. So, I taught a class one time of all freshmen and sophomore high school kids, and I vowed I would never do that again. New American Standard. New American Standard. If I have started out with 30, probably 25 will finish. And some years it's 100%, some years it's 50. It's just, yeah, I do. Like I say, my spiritual gift is nagging, so I exercise it diligently. So if you miss a class and don't tell me, I consider that to be irresponsible. And so I really I'll send a note, send an email, send a text, make a phone call. If somebody just doesn't show up and I didn't get something from them, for they would say they weren't coming, I'll just send a note and say, hey, missed you, and blah, blah, blah. So I early on in class, I basically say that. This leadership class, leadership is based on God's using you, and He uses you if you've got certain character traits. One of the character traits is being faithful. You're faithful with a few things, I'll put you in charge of many things. Here's the characteristics of faithful men. And so if you're not going to attend class, something happens, that's fine, but don't just not show up. It should be in your notebook. I think so. And I have quite a few sermons online on just those character traits. Did a series on it. I wrote a book on it. It's an e-book on the various character traits, and then I go through. I probably have 6 or 7 lessons in leadership class on key ones. Faithfulness is one of them. Talk about growing in character and becoming like Christ. Any other questions? Of disciplines? Yeah. I don't have a list of those. That's all I use is 7. Okay, yeah, you can. There's a number of books out that have way more than that. I just slipped my brain right now, but I have them all. And so I think if you were to collect all of them, especially the early church fathers, some of the ones that he come up with 21, and they include disciplines like solitude, silence, fasting, those kinds of discipline. So I've never been able to pull off those. So okay, I'm going to move to the next lesson and teach it, and it. I'll probably only get partway through it and then have to pick it up because I'll keep on the schedule here. So this one on authority, have you found that one? That's my first lesson that I teach in leadership class. So I put that in there basically to show you the example of what I teach, and also the one on goals and the one on time management. But this is sort of one of the bases of the class in the sense of what is leadership and how it works from a Christian perspective, from a biblical perspective. If you found it, it looks like you're all still looking. 26, yeah, okay. Number one, leadership is not necessarily being in charge of something or someone. You don't have to have a title, boss, to be a leader. Mark 10, Jesus says, calling them to himself, he said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Their great men exercise authority over them, but it is not this way among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant." And so as we look at leadership and use the word influence, the biblical model or method is way different than the world's. Number two, leadership is influence. Those in your life change because of your influence in their life. So the example of being salt and being light would be influence. We influence those around us. And there used to be an advertisement. I always wanted to try to find it, use it, but I haven't been able to do that yet. I can't remember which company it was, but the advertisement went when somebody from this particular person talked, everybody shut up and listened. Does anybody remember what that was? E.F. Hutton, yeah. And so that's influence. You've got a reputation, a character, and so when you talk, people listen. You may not have a title, you may not be good looking, you may be not real intelligent, but if you've got influence, and that influence, as I teach in class, comes from God. Number three, the people in your life change their behavior, their priorities, their values, their beliefs. Their relationship with God, their motivation, their habits because of your influence in their lives. So we all adjust in life as we go through life, and a lot of that is based on people that we admire, that have character. We, without even thinking about it, begin to act the way they act, talk the way they talk, make choices the way they do. Now, if it's a little bit, you got a little influence, but if you have a lot of influence, then it produces major character change in those that are around you, that you work with, that are in your family. And so that's real biblical leadership. Number four, some people have a negative influence. And we'll use the phrase, they're bad influence. So this is one of the things we would teach our kids over and over again. And they would memorize Proverbs and other verses that talks about you become who you hang around. Proverbs says, don't go with an angry man, otherwise you'll learn his ways. And 1 Corinthians, do not be deceived, bad company corrupts good morals. And the verses of that sort. And so you need to be careful who you spend time with because you become like them. And so our kids were little. And then as they got a little bit older, we basically believed that the more proactive you were in attempting to influence others, the less influence they would have on you. In other words, with our kids, if we wanted them to, we had a school here for all our kids went through it, but they would go up and play football, volleyball at the public school, and then sometimes would enroll a few classes as well. And so Seth came home one day and he said, "Dad, I'm going to a party tonight for the football team." And I said, "You know, I grew up in sports and I know how those parties go. I'm not sure that's a good idea." And he says, "Dad, I'm already a little bit on the outs because I go to the Christian school and I've had to earn my way into the team. I think it would be a good idea if I went." And so I said, "All right." And he wants to use the car. I said, you're going to be home about 9? Dad, the party will just be going. I'd like to stay till 2. I said, "Whoa, no, not. What are you talking about, 2 o'clock in the morning? Give me a break." So we negotiated. Pretty soon we arrived at midnight. And I think he had that in mind at the start, you know. So he's going to come home at midnight. And so he comes in about 5 minutes till midnight. I'm sitting in my recliner. And he says, "You still up?" I said, "Yeah, I'm sitting here praying for you." He says, "Well, your prayers got answered." He said, "I was a positive influence, and I didn't get influenced. I was," and the word we used all the time I shared with you, "I was a thermostat, not a thermometer." And I said, "Good boy." Went to bed, and I went to bed. But that was the principle that we operated by. The more you proactively choose to influence, the less you'll be influenced, acted upon. If you're neutral, then you tend to get drawn into the environment that you're in unless you proactively choose to act differently. Proverbs 22:24, "Do not associate with a man given to anger. Go with a hot-tempered man. You will learn his ways and find a snare for yourself." 1 Corinthians 15:33, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." Number 5, some people have a little bitty amount of positive influence and others, some have a huge amount. Number 6, a major goal of leadership class that I teach is training is to increase the positive, godly influence that people have in the lives of others. And so that's the big push of the class, is for you to be a leader in your workplace, in your neighborhood, in your family, in any environment you find yourself in. That means that you influence those around you by the way you talk, the way you act, the choices you make. People want to be like you, even if it's not a conscious thing, but you move people by your influence. Some have huge influence in people, others have a little bitty, some is negative. 7, very few people are a major positive influence in the lives of others who don't consciously choose to be. So you may be a person of high character, but if you don't choose to, as salt and light influence, you won't do a lot of influence. Now, if you become aware of the power of influence and of authority that God would give you, then you begin to talk and act in such a way that you know this is going to have an influence on people. And so one of the things that I'll do in our corporate prayer times is I can hear, as people pray, the direction things are going. And sometimes, especially here in the last couple of years, I left my phone on my desk, but I didn't turn it off, and it's Bluetooth into my hearing aids. So I've just got a sports score. So if anybody wants to know, it's going in a direction that becomes a kind of politics. Everything that's going on, somebody will start praying about that, and it'll go, south fast. And so I will purposely, consciously choose to pray something that's over here. Now, when I do that, then everything moves. Now, I know that will happen because I have influence with those who listen to me, and I know that. I've earned that, and I'm in that position to be able to influence direction, and so I will consciously choose to pray something that's going to pull things back at a place that ought to be, rather than just let it go. And so the more you understand the power of influence and the more you begin to understand the techniques or the way things you can do to have an influence, the more impact you have. So most of it is the way you live, but what you speak, how you talk, is a major, major part of it. And that's why quoting verses in class, giving testimonies in class. A lot of Christians are pretty timid when it comes to talking, saying things, even short amount of information. So I tell lots of stories about that. Oh, there's my phone right there. I can turn that baby off. We on 8? 8. The major part of this class is making you aware of the power of influence. Number 9, another major goal of leadership training is teaching the principles of how to increase the level of influence that you have in the lives of other people in your life. So if we were to say you have this sort of invisible ability, power to influence, you got a level 1. If you move up to a level 5 or a level 10, your ability to influence is going to go up dramatically. How do you do that? What will increase your ability to influence people in your environment that will grant you more authority? And so that's a major part of the class, is how to increase your ability to influence people positively towards Christ by the way you live, especially by the way you talk. Number 10, or 9, which one? 10? Yeah. There are 2 sides to the coin of leadership influence. The first is the change that others make because of your example. Your actions, your words. That's the obvious one. You act a certain way, you talk a certain way, and other people listen and see, and they begin to move in the direction of your influence in their life. 1 Peter 5:2, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily according to the will of God, not for sordid gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. Examples to the flock. So you talk a certain way, you live a certain way, and people do what you do. That's examples to the flock. John 13:15, I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you. Philippians 3:17, brethren, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. 1 Thessalonians 1:6, you also became imitators of us and of the Lord. Imitators, Paul said, of us, having received the word in much tribulation with the joy of the Holy Spirit, so that you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia, for the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith toward God has gone forth, so that we have no need to say anything. Number 11, the second way we influence others is by the change that God causes to take place in their life through us. So he will work in people's lives through us, and God doesn't do things in a vacuum. He does things through people. Let's see, we need to back up. Are we at 11? There we go. So this is a kind of a mental understanding how things operate. If you're going to tune up a car, if you're going to grow corn, if you know certain rules of how this makes. So this is a leadership principle, is that God will work in your life through me. But what prompts him to do that? And it'll be my character that God honors and uses. And then he will work in you. The obvious would be teaching or preaching. So God works in your life on the basis of what I say. Some preach and teach, not much happens, and others preach and teach, and a lot happens. And so we can say, well, that's all because of my skill, my ability to communicate, my passion. That's what's doing it. Well, there's obviously going to be part of it, but there's a supernatural element in which God does the work in people's hearts and lives. He doesn't do that through everybody. Just those who have the requirements, as it were, that he uses. 12, God amplifies our efforts to influence others as we meet the requirements that He's established to be His leader. He amplifies what we do as we meet the requirements. Now, the illustration I use is operating a backhoe. When I was a kid on the farm, we didn't have a backhoe many of the years, and so if we needed a hole dug, I dug it with a shovel. It was a lot of work. And we got a backhoe for our tractor. After that, we could dig a hole to China. All to do just move the lever, move the lever. I still made the choices, but what I did was amplified many times over with the power of hydraulics. And so, as a believer in Christ, the Spirit of God living in me, as I lead, as I preach, as I influence, God amplifies what I do based on who I am, the character I have. 1 Corinthians 4:1, let a man regard us in this manner as servants of Christ, stewards of the mysteries of God. In this case, moreover, it is required. Who does that requiring? Obviously, God. Of stewards that they be found trustworthy. So God says, if I'm going to work through you as a servant of mine, you got to be trustworthy. 2 Timothy 2:20, now in a large house there are not only gold vessels, silver vessels, vessels of wood and earthenware, but some to honor, some to dishonor. That is, an individual whom God is going to work through. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from these things, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified, useful to the master. I love that phrase. Useful to the master, prepared for every good work. How do you become that person? Useful to the master, prepared for every good work. If a man cleanses himself from these things, read the context there around what Paul's talking to Timothy. And major thing that is being issued there is moral purity. And so there's a character, there's a behavior pattern that you become useful to God. Hebrews 4 talks about those who are useless, good for nothing. I wouldn't like to be there. When I was a kid, we used to go, I told you, we would go coon hunting with a neighbor, Hank Woodruff. And so I wanted to get my own coon dog. So I saved up, bought one hunting dog. His name was Luther. And got him, and so I was, okay, I'm excited. I got my gun. We're going to go down to the creek and do some coon hunting. Well, as soon as I got my gun out, Luther, he went under the house and hid. And Dad says, I think you got a dog that's gun shy. Luther was useless. Good for nothing. He wouldn't even chase cows. So we changed his name from Luther to Useless. And there's people in the church right there. Only God can see it, but it says useless. Good for nothing. So I want to be, Paul's admonition, useful to the master, prepared for every good work. So the more useful you become, the more influence you have. And so that's the goal of the leadership class. That first lesson is we talk about what can you do, how can you act, what can you change in order to become a golden vessel in God's hands that will do all kinds of great things. Number 13, major goal of leadership training is to teach what God requires in the life of a person to be used by Him to be a positive, godly influence in the life of others. Now, if I have a class of a dozen guys and I give this much information, the goal is that they would be, yeah, that's what I want. As a husband, as a father, as an employee, as an employer, as a part of a church family, as a part of a community, I really would like to grow where I have influence. And so this first lesson then sort of hooks them in the sense of, okay, learn the principles and learn how to put them into practice. 14, I call the supernatural power of God that works in and through us in the lives of others authority. Several characteristics of authority. It's not force of your character. It's not intimidation. It's given to you by God. It's given to you by God, and you can't see it. It's like a magnet. It has a force And when it moves, the iron filings move. It's an invisible force given to you by God, and it really is amazing. Mark 1:22, they were amazed at his teaching, speaking of Jesus, for he was teaching them as one having authority. And so it wasn't the way he was dressed. It wasn't even the words that he said. It was simply the fact that when he taught, there was something in them that wanted to do, to follow, and they recognized that authority. Matthew 10:1, Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority. This authority was over unclean spirits, to cast them out, to heal every kind of disease, every kind of sickness. So our authority is going to be primarily in influencing people, moving them as we gain that authority. Number 15, no person has much positive godly leadership or influence in others without God's authority. Without God's authority. So the question is, what will it take on my behalf, on my end, what will it take in my behavior, my lifestyle, for God to give me authority and to give me more and more? 16, when I have God's authority in my life, leadership is easy. When I don't, leadership is impossible. If you're going to lead with techniques from people, you can influence, but it's not even close to being the kind of influence you have when you have God's authority in your life. "17, when I have God's authority working in me, people follow. When I lead, they listen. When I speak, they want to do what I do." So when you understand this as a leader, as a pastor, you recognize, okay, God gives me authority. When I have that authority in me, then people follow. They listen. They act. They make choices based on that influence that I have in my leadership. 18. Authority is the power to influence the environment around us. It's being a thermostat instead of a thermometer. "19, God loves to give his authority to those who want it. Want it not in a prideful, but we want to influence, we want to change, we want people to grow, become more like Jesus. And so when we understand the concept of influence, leadership, authority, and we begin to grasp the principles and how to get it, how to earn it, what God requires in order to be given it, then we understand that the more I have, the more I can influence, the more change I can bring into the life of people around me. 20, God will not use an unqualified leader even if that person has the position or title and there is a great need for a leader. So when he gives authority, that's a character trait, a holiness level, a righteousness level that God blesses and gives greater levels of authority to. So the classic verse that they memorize is the parable of the talents. One is given 5, one is given 2, one is given 1, and the one with 5 earns 5, and he comes to Jesus and he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things." And so obviously there's a future application of that, but it's even now in life. You were faithful. I will put you in charge of more. Now I understand that as a dad. Seth came home 5 minutes before midnight and was an influence. So in my mind, he now earned greater authority or freedom to not only go, but to use the car because he proved faithful to his commitment of being home at a particular time. Had he showed up at 12:30, the next event would have been way less. He would have lost authority or privilege because of that behavior. So God he operates the same way. We're faithful, then we get more. We're faithful and we get more. And we use what we have to positively to influence people, and then we get more and more authority. Number 21, the Bible is full of examples of leaders who had authority from God. Working through qualified leaders is God's method. That's God's method. 22, everything rises and falls on leadership. John Maxwell says that all the time. So, I don't know how many of you are into football. I like NFL and college football and watch. So this time of year, something happens fairly regularly. That is, coaches get fired. And they get fired on the basis of performance. And coaches get hired. They talk about certain coaches being available. Wow, he's going to be a good coach. My favorite team is the Jacksonville Jaguars. And the reason is because my favorite quarterback is Trevor Lawrence. And my favorite coach is Doug Peterson. And so if they were in Seattle, then Seattle would be my favorite team. And so it's mostly based on players. I kept track of Trevor Lawrence all the way through his college years. So why do they fire a coach? He lost. Made poor decisions. So they understand, the owners of the football team understand something. And so when you listen to the commentators talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars, their team is totally turned around this year. And who gets the credit in every conversation? Doug Peterson, the coach. They hired a good coach, and as a result of a good coach, the whole team is playing as a team. They're doing well. Last year they had a bad coach, and Trevor Lawrence had a bad year. And so they understand that. Football teams rise and fall on the basis of the leadership. Basketball teams rise and fall on the basis of the leadership. Families rise and fall on the basis of the leadership. Churches rise and fall on the basis of leadership. Everything rises and falls on leadership. And so in our church, the more qualified leaders we have that understand this principle of authority and influence, the more ministry happens, the more lives are changed. 23, good families are a result of good spiritual leadership. Good churches are a result of good spiritual leadership. Good ministries are a result of good spiritual leadership. Now, one of the things that I do in the classes, in the notebook, there is the lesson for the week, and then there's an identical lesson with the blanks filled. And the following week, they fill the blanks in from the previous week's lesson from memory. And there's a score given for that. And so when I teach this particular lesson that has that in it, I say, okay, next week, all you got to do is remember the word good on that question. And you've got it. So that's the lesson. Next week, fill in the blanks from memory. So they review what I taught, and then they fill it in from memory, so it sticks it in their brain. And so that's one of the challenges that some have, is remembering those and filling it in. But it's a cool way to get them to remember what you're teaching. 24, JBC will be wholly healthy, growing on the basis of the size of the foundation made up of qualified leaders. The more we have, the better we'll do. So that's my goal, is to have a lot of really good qualified leaders that understand the power of influence and authority that they earn on the basis of their character and their personal growth.